Prequels can be a notoriously hard thing to pull off correctly. Given that the audience already knows how the basic story is going to end, and how nothing that happens in said prequel was important enough to affect the story it's a precursor to, most of the time they're generally viewed as useless. Even something as famous as the Star Wars prequels are infamous for how divisive they are, which I talked about at length in another video which you can find a link in the description to. Though to be fair, the issues many have with the Star Wars prequels do extend beyond the normal problems that come with such movies. But the point is, for a variety of reasons, prequels often get it wrong more often than they get it right. But today, instead of going over all the different ways prequels can drop the ball, I would instead like to go over perhaps one of the best examples of a prequel done right. And there will be spoilers for the movie in question ahead, so in case you haven't seen it yet and don't want anything ruined, you shouldn't proceed with this video. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to cut right to the chase, the prequel in question here that managed to do everything correctly where so many others fail is Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Now, let me just clarify right off the bat that I'm not saying Furiosa is a perfect movie, just that it does everything perfectly as a prequel exclusively. Because the main problem most prequels suffer from is that they tend to feel very contrived in how certain events play out, as well as often retcon events that were implied, or sometimes even directly stated, to have played out a certain way in the original movie. But Furiosa doesn't do any of this, and instead very much feels like the real origin story for the characters in Mad Max Fury Road, and if anything makes you appreciate Furiosa and her struggles even more, which, in the end, is pretty much what a prequel is supposed to do. Because once again, and perhaps most importantly, it doesn't recontextualize much about what's established in Fury Road. All it really does is give the audience a much broader and more detailed layout of how life at the Citadel was. Because while it was clearly a system that worked in Mad Max Fury Road, it's still interesting to see how it all actually worked. But moreover, the few things that at first glance might look like retcons actually make sense in the right context. Like, for example, in Fury Road, one gets the impression that Furiosa and her mother were kidnapped by Immortan Joe and his forces, while here we see that Dementis' forces were actually the ones behind that instead, and Immortan Joe didn't come into the picture until years later. But again, this actually makes sense, because if Immortan Joe had kidnapped Furiosa himself, he never would have trusted her with the war rig or anything else that was important to him out of a fear that she might try and escape. But because a third party was the one to kidnap her instead, and he never finds that out, it makes sense that he would be more trusting of her once she proves her worth, because as far as he knows, she has nowhere else to go. And all of this is only reinforced in Fury Road when he insistently asks, where is she taking them? Because had his men kidnapped her, he would already know the answer to that question. Or even Dementis' whole takeover of Gastown and his subsequent war with Immortan Joe. Given how the Citadel is implied to always be fighting somebody, it's no wonder that the 40-day war, as the history man calls it, would become nothing more than a footnote in their history and would be long forgotten by the events of Fury Road, especially since the war and the People Eaters becoming the new ruler of Gastown all happened at least 5 years beforehand. Even Dementis himself qualifies here, as no matter what happened to him, Furiosa got her revenge on him by the end of the movie, so it makes sense that she'd never bother mentioning him again and simply focus on finally getting home. But as I touched on before, even beyond retcons, one of the biggest problems prequels usually have is that certain events tend to feel contrived because they have to happen, but the writer hadn't figured out the details when they wrote the original. But once again, that isn't the case here. Furiosa getting kidnapped, her mother being killed, her various attempts to escape the Citadel and get back home, all of this simply feels like a natural progression of the story instead of things that happen because they have to line up with Fury Road. And as I just pointed out, it even adds things it didn't need to help its follow-up story make even more sense. Even her being an escaped would-be bride of Immortan Joe, or the existence of Praetorian Jack to teach her all the skills she later displays. All of this helps enhance the story, not confuse it like most prequels do. But really, the best example I can give for that is her arm. Because, being a prequel, everybody going in knows that she's going to lose her left arm at some point. Now, given the fact that she's a warrior with years of experience, she could have realistically lost it at any time. It could have been during the biggest battle of her life, or some little indiscriminate skirmish where she just happened to get unlucky. But given that this film tells her life story, one is inclined to believe that she'll lose it in some significant way. And yet, when the time finally does come, it doesn't feel contrived in the slightest. It simply feels like that was the natural progression of events. Furiosa hurt her arm, then was strung up by it, so she hacked it off to escape and built a mechanical one out of parts from the Citadel. To put it simply, even though pretty much anybody can see it coming a mile away, when it finally does happen, it doesn't feel like the movie is doing it out of obligation, but rather because that's how things actually went. Jack lost his life, and Furiosa lost her arm. To put it all another way, even if the movie weren't a prequel and was its own standalone film, that whole scene would still work perfectly as is. And the same applies to everything else in this movie that ties into Mad Max Fury Road. It achieves the delicate balance of being both a prequel while also telling its own story, and manages to do so without one ever stepping on the toes of the other. Now, some would argue that this movie functions as a much better prequel than most because George Miller actually wrote the screenplay for it around the same time he wrote the one for Mad Max Fury Road, which could go a long way in explaining why nothing in Furiosa feels contrived and everything fits together so smoothly. And that probably does have a lot to do with it. Let's face facts here. It had a luxury most other prequels don't have. But that still doesn't mean it couldn't have fallen into a lot of the same pitfalls and traps that most other prequels do. So all of this is still noteworthy regardless. That simply put, George Miller knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote this movie to make sure that it felt like a natural, organic backstory to both Furiosa and the Citadel itself. It doesn't rely on irony or blatant retcons to tell its story, but instead feels like the earlier part of a story that was already told, which is exactly what a prequel should be. So, like I said at the beginning, Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is by no means a perfect movie, but it is the perfect example of how to do a prequel correctly. It doesn't rely on the audience having seen the original, doesn't forsake what was already established for the sake of telling its own story, and doesn't shove events that the audience knows have to happen out of nowhere simply for the sake of consistency. Instead, it manages to tell its story while not only fitting perfectly within the confines of what was already established, but enhances the story of Fury Road and helps it make even more sense rather than take away from it. And once again, it feels as if events very well could have happened the way they're shown based off what is known in Fury Road. And as I noted at the start, considering how hard it is for prequels to get all these elements right, that only makes Furiosa, a Mad Max saga's achievements even more notable, to the point that I would say as a writer myself, that if there was ever a movie to perfectly demonstrate how a prequel should be made, this would be it. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is one of the greatest prequels ever made as far as consistency with the original goes? Or do you believe there are other prequels out there that have done it all better? Please let me know in the comments. And please keep in mind that you don't have to agree with this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion, and if you think I was wrong about everything I said, that is perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.